In a small, quiet town, Elellanar Morgan finds herself standing at the threshold of her grandfather's garage where memories linger in the dust. Since his passing, a deep ache has settled in her heart, and as she steps inside, the familiar scent of oil and wood fills her senses. But it's not just the ghosts of the past that draw her in. It's Max, her grandfather's loyal German shepherd, still guarding the space like he always did. What secrets lay hidden within these walls, and how will the bond between Elellanar and Max help uncover the truth? Watch as Elellanar begins a journey to unlock the mystery her grandfather left behind. Don't miss this emotional tale of legacy, love, and loyalty. Elellanar Morgan stood motionless at the front door of her grandfather Thomas Morgan's house. The cold breeze brushing past her, carrying the smell of autumn leaves and the faint scent of pine. The world seemed to stand still around her as she took in the silence that had settled over the house since his passing. Her eyes slowly traced the familiar lines of the old wooden structure, the house that had always been her refuge and the home of so many memories. Now it felt different, hollow. The funeral had been 2 days ago, and the ache of losing him still felt raw. The warmth of his presence, his gentle voice, the stories he'd told, all of it was gone. She had been by his side when he took his last breath. The hospice nurse had assured her it was peaceful, but to Elellanar, peace had never felt so heavy. The loss of Thomas, her protector, her guide, and her grandfather, left a void that nothing could fill. Her gaze wandered to the garage at the far end of the property. The same garage she had been forbidden from entering for most of her life, a place filled with memories of her childhood and a space that seemed to harbor more than just tools and dust. The garage had always held a sense of mystery, a place where her grandfather kept things he never spoke of, as if they were too sacred, too personal to share. It had been his private sanctuary. Elellanar took a deep breath before stepping forward, the gravel crunching beneath her boots as she made her way to the familiar wooden door. Her hand lingered on the cold metal doorknob, the weight of it making her pause. She could still see him in her mind's eye, standing at the door, always the one to greet her with a quiet smile and a word of reassurance. The door creaked open, and the dim light inside the garage enveloped her. The scent of oil and old wood hit her immediately, familiar and nostalgic, but it was tinged with something else, an emptiness that only deepened the ache in her chest. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed by the slightest movement. She stepped further, in her eyes adjusting to the low light. The garage seemed unchanged, frozen in time. The shelves lined with tools, the workbench where her grandfather had once fixed her bicycle, the boxes filled with forgotten memories. But then she saw him. There, standing by the door to the workshop, was Max. The German shepherd, now old and gray, around the muzzle, stood motionless, his amber eyes watching her intently. His coat was weathered, his movements slow, but there was no mistaking the loyalty in his gaze. Max had been Thomas's constant companion for as long as Elellanar could remember. The dog had been with him through thick and thin, guarding the garage, keeping silent watch over the secrets Thomas had never spoken aloud. As Elellanar stepped closer, Max's tail gave a single slow wag. His eyes softened, as if acknowledging her presence, as if silently offering his support, his loyalty, as he always had. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing through his fur. The bond between them was unspoken, yet so strong. Max was more than just a dog to her. He was the last living piece of Thomas's world. For a moment, Elellanar stayed there, the weight of her grief momentarily lifted by the comfort of Max's presence. The garage, full of memories and mysteries, felt strangely familiar again, as though nothing had truly changed. But Elellanar knew it had. The garage wasn't just a place for tools anymore. It was a place of secrets. Secrets that, like Max, were waiting to be uncovered. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garage floor, Elellanar stood up, her heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and curiosity. She had come here to say goodbye, but it seemed that the garage had other plans for her. With one last look at Max, Elellanar walked toward the desk in the corner where she had seen her grandfather work many times. The adventure to uncover the truths Thomas had left behind was about to begin. Elellanar stood quietly, her fingers brushing the edge of her grandfather's desk. The surface, worn smooth by years of use, felt cold beneath her touch, but it was a comforting kind of cold. Familiar like the old leather chair that had once cradled him in the evenings after a long day in the garage. As she ran her fingers along the oak desk, memories began to surface like dust rising in the air. Her thoughts wandered back to her childhood, to the times she'd spent with Thomas and Max in this very garage. It had always been a special place for them, a sanctuary of sorts. Max had been by her grandfather's side long before Elellanar had even understood the bond between man and dog. To her, it seemed as though Max had always been there, silent, steadfast, and always watching over them, guarding the quiet corners of their lives. Elellanar could still see it clearly, the afternoons when she'd race through the house, eager to join her grandfather in the garage. The door would creak open, and there he'd be. Thomas, his weathered hands gently working on his latest project. Max would always be close by, lying at Thomas's feet or pacing around the room, as if protecting the space from any intruder, real or imagined. His dark eyes would follow her every move, but there was always a calmness in his gaze, as if he knew the importance of those moments. The smell of motor oil, sawdust, and the faint scent of pine would fill the air as her grandfather worked with patience and precision. Max never strayed far from Thomas's side. In fact, Max seemed to sense exactly when Thomas needed him the most. When Elellanar was young, she didn't fully understand it, but as she grew older, she began to see that Max wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian. He wasn't just there to play fetch or to lay by the fireplace. He was there to protect Thomas's secrets, his dreams, and the quiet, unspoken moments that made up the core of their lives. There was one particular afternoon that stood out to her. She was about 7 years old, sitting quietly on the worn couch in the garage, watching her grandfather work. Max was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but always alert. She had asked him once, "Grandpa, why does Max never leave you?" Thomas had smiled a soft, knowing smile that spoke volumes. "Because, Ellie," he had said, "he's not just my dog. He's my partner. He protects what matters most." Elellanar remembered feeling a strange mix of awe and comfort in those words. She hadn't fully grasped their meaning then, but she understood the unspoken bond that existed between them. It wasn't just the loyalty of a dog to his owner. It was something deeper. It was a partnership built on years of shared experiences, trust, and understanding. Max had been a witness to all of it. Thomas's long hours in the garage, his quiet moments of contemplation, and his rare bursts of laughter. But Max had also been the one to stand guard when the outside world intruded, when things in Thomas's life weren't as simple as they seemed. And Max had never asked questions. He simply observed, listened, and protected. As Elellanar gazed around the garage now, she could almost hear the echoes of those days. The sound of her grandfather's voice, soft but firm, and Max's steady presence at his side. The garage, filled with tools and old projects, had always been a place of work and purpose, but it was also a place of memories. Now those memories felt heavier than ever, and Elellanar couldn't help but wonder what secrets they had hidden. She turned her gaze back to Max, still sitting by the door, his eyes fixed on her. His once sharp, alert gaze had softened over the years, but the loyalty in his eyes remained unchanged. It was as if he knew the time had come for her to uncover the truths Thomas had left behind. With a final glance at the dog who had been both protector and witness to her grandfather's life, Elellanar took a deep breath and walked toward the workbench. She was about to begin the journey that would unravel the mysteries her grandfather had kept hidden, and Max would be there guarding her every step of the way. The air in the garage was thick with the familiar smell of oil dust and aged wood, a scent that immediately brought Elellanar back to her childhood. It was as if the space was frozen in time. Each corner held memories, and the tools that lined the shelves still seemed to hum with the energy of her grandfather's hands. She stepped deeper into the dimly lit space, her boots echoing on the concrete floor. And for a moment she could almost imagine Thomas there, with her working away at a project, his presence still lingering in the air. As she moved through the garage, Elellanar's fingers lightly grazed the surfaces of the worn tools that hung neatly on the walls. Each one had its place perfectly organized, as if ready for the next task. There were screwdrivers, wrenches, hammers, all showing signs of use. Some with chipped handles, others with worn-down edges. Thomas had always been meticulous, a trait Elellanar had admired growing up. But now in the stillness of the garage, the tools seemed like silent witnesses to a lifetime of work, a lifetime of secrets. On one of the shelves, Elellanar found a collection of technical books, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. She pulled one from the shelf and flipped through the pages. It was filled with diagrams and schematics, mechanical drawings that made her realize just how much Thomas had known, how skilled he had been. These books weren't just old engineering manuals. They were a window into her grandfather's mind, a mind that had been working on things far beyond her understanding. The technical jargon seemed to dance on the pages, but Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that these books held more than just knowledge. They were a key to unlocking the mysteries of her grandfather's past. Her gaze then drifted to the back of the garage, to the two large shapes covered with dusty old tarps. They had always been there, hidden behind piles of tools and unused equipment, a source of endless curiosity for Elellanar as a child. She remembered asking Thomas what was under those covers, but he had always given the same answer, just old projects, things from another time. But now those words seemed hollow. Elellanar's heart began to race as she slowly made her way toward the covered shapes. She felt a mixture of excitement and dread. What could her grandfather have been hiding all these years? Why had he never let her see what lay beneath the tarps? She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly as they brushed against the rough, dusty fabric. The material was stiff from years of neglect, but there was still a faint warmth to it, as though the objects underneath had been waiting patiently to be uncovered. Elellanar hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before pulling the tarp away from the first shape. The dust exploded into the air, and for a moment she could barely see. But as it settled, Elellanar gasped. There, revealed in the dim light of the garage, stood a pristine white Lamborghini Countach. Its angular lines and dramatic styling unmistakable even to her untrained eye. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. It was as if she had uncovered a treasure hidden in plain sight. The car gleamed untouched by time, its sleek surface reflecting the faint glow from the dim overhead lights. Elellanar's mind raced. How had her grandfather come to possess such a car? It was far beyond anything she could have imagined. She had never known Thomas to be a man of wealth or luxury. In fact, she had always seen him as a humble, modest man, more comfortable in his worn-out work clothes than in anything extravagant. But there it was, a masterpiece of engineering and design, sitting in the middle of the garage, untouched, preserved like a relic from another time. Her thoughts were interrupted as she turned her attention to the second covered shape. With a sense of urgency, she pulled the tarp away, revealing something even more astonishing. A Ferrari 250 GTO, its vibrant red paint gleaming under the faint light, its curves smooth and seductive. Elellanar was struck by the sheer beauty of the car, the iconic lines that had made it one of the most sought-after vehicles in the world. She had heard of it before, of course, but never in her wildest dreams did she think she would be standing before one. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took in the sight of both cars. They were not just any cars. These were legends. Cars that few would ever dream of owning, let alone keeping hidden in a garage for decades. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Thomas hadn't just been a simple mechanic. He had been part of something much bigger, and these cars, these treasures, were evidence of that. But the question remained. Why had he kept them hidden? As Elellanar stood there taking in the shocking discovery, she couldn't help but feel that she had just uncovered the first layer of a much deeper mystery. And she was determined to uncover the rest. Elellanar stood frozen in front of the two legendary cars, her mind racing, as she tried to make sense of the incredible discovery. The Lamborghini Countach and the Ferrari 250 GTO were beyond anything she could have imagined finding in this small garage. The thought that her grandfather Thomas had kept such treasures hidden for so long felt almost unreal. But as the excitement slowly began to subside, another quieter thought crept into her mind. Why? Why had he kept these cars hidden away from everyone, including his family? Thomas had never been a man to boast about wealth or luxury. He had always lived humbly, keeping to himself. Yet here she was staring at the two most valuable cars in the world, tucked away like forgotten relics. There had to be more to this story. Something deeper. Something that had remained buried beneath years of secrecy. Her gaze shifted to the workbench across the room. She had seen her grandfather work there countless times. His hands steady and precise, never leaving a trace of his plans behind. But now with the garage practically overflowing with answers, yet still veiled in mystery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her. Something more than just the cars. As her eyes scanned the room, they landed on the old wooden desk tucked in the corner. It was the same desk Thomas had used for as long as Elellanar could remember. The surface was worn, its corners smoothed from decades of use. She had always admired the simplicity and elegance of the desk, but it had never occurred to her that it might hold answers to the questions that were swirling in her mind. She moved toward the desk, her footsteps light against the concrete floor. As she reached the chair, she paused and glanced back at the garage. Max, still standing quietly in the doorway, watched her with those knowing eyes. Elellanar gave him a small, reassuring smile before turning her attention back to the desk. Opening the drawer, she began to sift through the papers inside. Old receipts, bills, and some faded letters. It wasn't until she reached the back of the drawer that her fingers brushed against something solid and cold. A key. Her breath caught in her throat. The key was old, its brass surface worn with age, but it was unmistakable. It had a certain weight to it, like it held the key to more than just a door. It held the key to a mystery that had been buried for years. Elellanar held the key in her hand, turning it over to examine it more closely. There were no markings, no labels, just a simple brass key. But she felt the gravity of it in her palm, like it was somehow connected to the secrets Thomas had kept hidden all these years. Her heart raced as she thought about the garage. She had just uncovered two of the most valuable cars in the world. But now she was certain that the key in her hand was the final piece of the puzzle. This key, she realized, wasn't just meant for any door. It was meant for the garage door, the one she had just opened, and the one that had kept the secrets of Thomas's past locked away for so long. But why had Thomas kept it so hidden? Why had he never mentioned it to her? The key wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of everything her grandfather had chosen to protect. It was as if he had known all along that someday someone would come to uncover the truth, to unravel the mysteries he had left behind. Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that this key was just the beginning. There was more to uncover, more to understand, and the path ahead seemed to stretch out before her, mysterious and full of possibilities. With the key in her hand, Elellanar knew one thing for certain. She had taken the first step toward unlocking the past, and whatever secrets it held, she was ready to face them. Elellanar stood there for a long moment, holding the key in her hand, as if it were a tangible piece of the past that had been waiting to be found. The garage, with all its secrets, seemed to breathe around her, and the weight of everything her grandfather had hidden began to settle on her shoulders. She was filled with a quiet resolve, a desire to uncover every part of Thomas's legacy, no matter how painful or complex it might be. But then, the sharp sound of her phone ringing shattered the stillness. Elellanar sighed, glancing at the screen. Robert? Her brother's name was flashing, the call coming in like a jolt of electricity. She had been expecting this. Robert was never far from her thoughts these days, especially after everything that had happened with Thomas's passing. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was waiting on the other end of the line, but finally she pressed accept and raised the phone to her ear. Ellie? Robert's voice came through crisp and practical as always. I've been talking to the bank, and we need to move fast. The house is in serious trouble. There's a second mortgage that's behind by 3 months, and if we don't act soon, they're going to foreclose. We need to sell everything, fast. Elellanar's stomach twisted. The urgency in Robert's voice was unmistakable. She had known the financial situation had been tight, but hearing the cold reality of it, straight from her brother, still stung. Robert, I didn't know about this second mortgage. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Elellanar's voice wavered, though she tried to sound calm. There was a pause on the other end, and then Robert's sigh carried over the phone. I didn't want to worry you. You had enough on your plate with Mom and then Grandpa's death. But now, we don't have time to waste. We need to sell the house, clear the debt, and move on. You don't want this hanging over you forever. Elellanar closed her eyes for a moment, rubbing her forehead. She had known this day would come, the day when the reality of everything would sink in. But hearing Robert speak so matter-of-factly about it made her feel as though the ground had slipped out from under her. What about Grandpa's things? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Robert didn't hesitate. We'll need to go through it all and liquidate anything of value. We can't afford to hang on to sentimental stuff. We need cash, Ellie. It's the only way we'll get out of this. His words hit her like a hammer. She could hear his frustration, his practicality. To him, everything was a transaction. Each object, each memory was just something to be sold or discarded for the sake of financial survival. But to Elellanar, it was never just about the money. The house, the things Thomas had left behind, they were more than just material possessions. They were a part of her grandfather's life, his work, his history, his secrets. Robert couldn't see that. He couldn't see the deeper value in what Thomas had hidden away for all these years. Robert, this isn't just about clearing debt, she said quietly, her voice firm now. This house, it's part of who we are. It's a part of Grandpa's legacy. We can't just throw it all away. There was a long pause. Elellanar could practically hear Robert's thoughts whirring through the phone line. I don't have time for this, Ellie. He finally replied, his voice colder now. We'll talk about it more when I get there, but we need to be realistic. Elellanar felt a lump form in her throat. She had always known that Robert was practical, often to the point of being indifferent to emotions or sentiment. But hearing him dismiss everything she held dear, everything that connected her to Thomas, was harder than she had anticipated. Okay, she whispered. I'll see you soon. The call ended with a click, and Elellanar lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen for a few seconds before putting it back in her pocket. Her hands felt cold, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She knew Robert was only doing what he thought was right, what he believed would fix everything. But to Elellanar, the solution wasn't as simple as selling the house and the cars. It wasn't about money. It was about preserving the legacy of a man who had built this life with quiet dedication. Someone who had shaped her world without ever asking for recognition. Elellanar glanced over at Max, who had silently padded up to her side. His presence was grounding a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. With a deep breath, she turned back to the garage, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let Thomas's legacy be erased just to pay off a debt. There were truths to uncover here, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Robert, stop her from finding them. As Elellanar stood there, her hand resting on Max's worn fur, her thoughts drifted back to the days when her relationship with Robert had first started to unravel. It wasn't something that had happened overnight. It was more like a slow, inevitable drift, a widening gap that had grown between them as they both followed their own paths. But there were memories that stood out as defining points in their strained relationship. She remembered the day Robert had left for New York. It was the same year she had been accepted into a prestigious nursing program at Boston University. She had been so excited, so full of hope for the future, but life had other plans. That year, her mother's multiple sclerosis had worsened, and Elellanar couldn't bear to leave her mother behind in such a fragile state. "I'm staying, Robert," she had told him, her voice firm, but filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. "I can't leave Mom right now. She needs me." Robert had looked at her, disbelief in his eyes. "You're throwing away your future," he had said, his words cutting through the air. "You've been given a chance, Ellie. A real chance to make something of yourself. And you're going to let it slip away." Elellanar had felt the weight of his words, the judgment in his tone. But in that moment, she had made her choice. She would stay. Her mother, struggling with her illness, needed her. The decision had been simple for Elellanar. It was the right thing to do. But to Robert, it was a decision she would regret. He had packed his bags, leaving her behind to stay with their parents, his voice still ringing in her ears. "You'll never make anything of yourself here in this town," Ellie, Robert had said, his back turned as he walked out the door. That had been the beginning of their separation. Robert had gone to New York, chasing his dreams of a successful career in accounting, while Elellanar remained in Milfield, tending to her mother and working at the local nursing home. Over time, their conversations had become fewer, and when they did speak, it was always about practical matters, never about the deeper connections that once bound them. Robert's life had become consumed with money, success, and the shiny objects that came with it. Things that Elellanar had never cared about. The gap between them grew wider with each passing year. Robert would visit, of course, but it was always brief, always about business or family obligations. Elellanar, on the other hand, was rooted in Milfield, her life devoted to helping others, to doing the quiet work that had always been her calling. As she stood in the garage, surrounded by her grandfather's secrets, Elellanar realized that her choices, the ones Robert had criticized so harshly, weren't things she regretted. The sacrifice she had made by staying wasn't a burden. It was a choice driven by love, a love that had never been conditional or tied to achievement. Her dedication to her family, to the people who needed her, wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was what had shaped her life, what had grounded her. Robert, with all his success, couldn't see that. He couldn't understand that real value wasn't found in titles or money. The worth of a person, the true measure of a life, wasn't in the things they accumulated, but in the things they gave. Elellanar had learned that lesson from Thomas, from the way he had lived his life with integrity, quietly building a legacy that would outlast anything Robert could buy with wealth. Max, sitting by her side in the quiet garage, was a reminder of the simple, powerful love that had always guided her. Loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that came from doing what was right, no matter the cost. Elellanar knew that despite the differences between her and Robert, she couldn't change him. But she could honor the legacy of her grandfather and continue to live the way he had taught her, by valuing love and family over anything else. Elellanar stood quietly in Thomas's study, surrounded by the remnants of his life. The room, once a sanctuary for her grandfather, was filled with shelves of old books, some on engineering, others on history, but all of them telling a story of a man who had quietly shaped the world around him. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books, the leather covers worn from years of use. Each one seemed to hold a secret, a piece of Thomas's past that had been carefully kept away from the world. Max, as always, was by her side, his amber eyes watching her intently, a silent guardian of the space. The dog had always been a part of Thomas's life, and now in this moment of reflection, he was a part of Elellanar's journey to uncover the man her grandfather had been. It was as if Max knew exactly what was at stake, what she needed to learn, and he was there every step of the way, silently watching over her as she delved into the world Thomas had left behind. The desk in the corner where Thomas had spent countless hours working was untouched, a perfect reflection of the man who had kept his life and his work private. Elellanar opened the top drawer, its familiar creak echoing through the quiet room. Inside, she found an assortment of papers, old receipts, faded letters, and small, meticulously written notes. She picked up one of the letters, its edges worn and yellowed with age, and began to read. It was from the 1960s, written by Thomas himself, discussing a project he had worked on with a company called Ferrari. Her heart raced as she read through the details. Talk of designs, innovations, and engines that would revolutionize the car industry. The letter was full of technical jargon, but Elellanar could sense the pride Thomas had taken in his work. He had been part of something bigger than she had ever imagined. Max padded over to her, his steps soft but sure, and sat at her feet. His head rested on her knee as if urging her to keep reading, to keep uncovering the past. Elellanar stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind racing with the implications of what she was learning. Thomas hadn't just been a mechanic, as Robert had always claimed. He had been an engineer, a visionary, who had worked with some of the most prestigious car manufacturers in the world. But why had he never told her about this? Why had he kept it hidden for so long? As Elellanar continued sifting through the papers, she came across a small leather-bound journal. She opened it carefully, the pages yellowed and brittle. It was filled with notes and sketches, all written in Thomas's neat, precise handwriting. The pages contained diagrams of engines, parts, and detailed calculations that revealed just how much he had contributed to the automotive world. The further she read, the more she realized how much her grandfather had kept to himself. How much of his life had been wrapped in secrecy, hidden away from the world. But it wasn't just the technical work that fascinated Elellanar. It was the glimpses of Thomas's character that began to emerge from these pages. His humility, his dedication, his belief that the value of a person wasn't in their possessions, but in what they gave to the world. These were the values that had shaped her grandfather's life values, that had influenced every aspect of his work and personal relationships. Max remained at her side, a constant presence as she pored over the journal. It was as if the dog too understood the importance of these revelations. He had witnessed Thomas's quiet dedication, his long hours in the garage, and now he was witnessing Elellanar's own journey to understand her grandfather on a deeper level. Together they were uncovering the man Thomas had been, and with each page turned, Elellanar felt closer to the truth. She had known Thomas as a loving grandfather, but she was beginning to see him as something more. Someone whose life had been far richer, far more complex than she had ever realized. With the journal in hand, Elellanar leaned back in the chair, her mind spinning with the knowledge she had just uncovered. The garage, the cars, the papers, it was all starting to make sense. Her grandfather's legacy was not just in the cars he had hidden away, but in the work he had done, the life he had built. And now it was up to her to honor that legacy. Elellanar stood up, her gaze sweeping the room. There was more to learn, more to uncover. The journey was just beginning. Elellanar moved slowly across the garage, her footsteps quiet against the cold concrete floor. The garage, filled with old tools and relics of her grandfather's past, seemed like a world frozen in time. But now, with the journal in her hands and a newfound understanding of the man Thomas had been, she couldn't help but feel that the garage held more than just memories. It held secrets, treasures that had been hidden away for years. Her gaze turned toward the two large shapes covered with faded tarps in the corner. She had seen them 1,000 times before, always pushed to the back of her mind as mere curiosities. Things her grandfather had never discussed, things that seemed too important, too mysterious to be part of everyday life. But now, knowing what she knew, they seemed to call to her their presence, beckoning her to finally uncover the truth. Max, as if sensing her anticipation, padded over to her side, his steady presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. The old German shepherd stood close, watching her with his calm, amber eyes. Elellanar took a deep breath and knelt beside the first tarp, her fingers brushing against the dusty fabric. She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a sense of urgency, she pulled the cover back. The air seemed to hold its breath as the tarp fluttered to the ground. For a brief moment, the dust settled around her, clouding her vision. When it cleared, Elellanar gasped. There before her stood a Ferrari 250 GTO, its sleek red curves gleaming in the dim light of the garage. It was more than just a car. It was a work of art, a machine of perfection. The paint was immaculate, its finish gleaming as if it had just rolled off the production line. The distinctive lines of the car were unmistakable, an iconic design that had made the Ferrari 250 GTO one of the most coveted vehicles in the world. Elellanar's heart raced as she stepped closer, her eyes drinking in every detail of the car. She had seen pictures, heard stories, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined standing in front of one. The Ferrari wasn't just a car, it was history. It was a symbol of engineering genius, a masterpiece that few people in the world would ever lay eyes on, let alone own. But as she stared at the Ferrari, her attention was drawn to the second shape beside it. Her breath caught as she reached out for the second tarp, her fingers trembling as she pulled it back. The reveal was even more astonishing than the first. A Lamborghini Countach stood before her, its angular lines and bold design more striking than anything Elellanar had ever seen. The car's vibrant white exterior reflected the dim light in the garage, its curves smooth and seductive. It was an engineering marvel, the epitome of luxury and power. A car that had captivated the imaginations of car enthusiasts around the world for decades. Elellanar took a step back, her mind reeling. She stood between two of the most legendary cars ever built, their presence in her grandfather's garage like a dream made real. She couldn't comprehend it. How had Thomas, the humble mechanic she had known, come to possess these priceless machines? These weren't just cars. They were treasures, and they held secrets of a life Elellanar had never fully understood. It felt as though a part of her grandfather, that she had never known, was being revealed to her, a side of him that had remained hidden for so long. Thomas had been a man of secrets, a man who had lived his life quietly, without fanfare. But these cars, they were a testament to a life lived with purpose, a life that had touched the world in ways Elellanar had never imagined. As she stood there, gazing at the two supercars, Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. There was more to this story, more to her grandfather's life, that she was determined to find out. The garage, once a place of mystery and silence, was now the key to unlocking a world of secrets, and Elellanar knew that the journey to understand Thomas had only just begun. Elellanar stood in the dim light of the garage, her heart still racing from the discovery of the two incredible cars, Ferrari and Lamborghini. Names that once seemed so distant, so out of reach. now sat before her as real as the worn desk that had once been her grandfather's. Yet despite the grandeur of the vehicles, there was something else in the garage that tugged at her curiosity, the envelope. She had found it tucked beneath the seat of the Lamborghini, its edges frayed from years of being hidden away. The envelope was thick, yellowed with age, and sealed with a simple wax stamp. Her grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable, the neat, precise strokes spelling out her name for Elellanar. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the paper inside a little brittle with age. Unfolding it, she read her grandfather's familiar handwriting, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of silence. "My dearest Elellanar," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I have left this world and you have come to understand what I have kept hidden for so long. The cars you have uncovered are not mere possessions. They are my legacy, my testament to a life lived with purpose." Elellanar paused, the words sinking in. This was more than just a letter. It was a guide, a message from Thomas himself, left for her to unravel his hidden world. Her breath caught in her throat as she read on. "These cars," the letter continued, "are not symbols of wealth. They are symbols of the work I have done, the work that has never been fully recognized. I was part of something much greater than you or anyone else could know." The Ferrari 250 GTO was the result of a project I worked on with Enzo Ferrari himself. The Lamborghini Countach represents years of work in engineering, a contribution I made in silence, out of love for the craft, not for fame or fortune. Elellanar's mind raced as the words washed over her. Her grandfather had been more than just a mechanic. He had been an engineer, a man whose work had shaped the very cars that had changed the automotive world. He had worked with legends alongside the names she had heard only in stories. And yet, he had kept all of it hidden. Why? "I know you must be asking why I kept all of this from you," the letter continued, "and why I kept these cars locked away. The truth is simple. I wanted you to understand the true value of these things, not in dollars and cents, but in the legacy they represent. I did not want the world to define me by what I owned, but by what I gave away. These cars are not meant to be sold, Elellanar. They are meant to be a part of something greater, something that will live on beyond my time." Elellanar could hardly believe what she was reading. It was as if her grandfather had known that one day she would be the one to uncover his secrets. The message in the letter was clear. These cars were not just his property. They were his legacy, a piece of his life that had been carefully preserved for her. "When you are ready," Thomas's letter ended, "you will understand the full extent of what these cars mean. Until then, keep them safe. Keep them as a reminder of what true value is. The world may never know the full story, but you will. And that is enough." Elellanar folded the letter slowly, her hands shaking. She felt the weight of her grandfather's words pressing down on her. The garage, the cars, the letter, they all pointed to something far bigger than she had ever imagined. This was not just about finding wealth. It was about understanding the depth of Thomas's life and the legacy he had carefully crafted. Max, who had been sitting silently by her side, now nudged her gently. His eyes, still as watchful as ever, seemed to echo the message of the letter. He had been her grandfather's companion, and now, in this moment, he was hers. She wasn't alone in this journey. Elellanar stood up, looking around the garage once more. It was no longer just a place filled with tools and forgotten projects. It was the heart of Thomas's hidden world, and she was only beginning to uncover it. The road ahead was still unclear, but Elellanar was ready to walk it. Elellanar sat back down on the workbench, the letter from her grandfather, now folded neatly in her hands. The words echoed in her mind, each one carrying weight. each one offering a glimpse into the world Thomas had carefully hidden from her. The cars, the legacy, and the truth about her grandfather's life. It all felt so much bigger than what she had known. But with each revelation, she was left with more questions than answers. Max, sensing her inner turmoil, padded over and lay down at her feet, his presence offering comfort in the face of the overwhelming mystery. Elellanar scratched his ears absent-mindedly, her mind racing. How could Thomas, a man who had lived so simply, have been part of something so grand? The Ferrari and Lamborghini were no ordinary cars. They were symbols of an era engineering marvels that few had access to, let alone kept hidden for decades. But why? What had her grandfather truly done, and why had he kept it from everyone, including her? She glanced back at the letter, reading the words once more. The world may never know the full story, but you will. Those words stuck with her. She had to know more. She couldn't leave the answers behind, just like the dust in this garage. There had to be more to Thomas's life, a hidden chapter that she was now determined to uncover. With renewed purpose, Elellanar stood up, the key to the garage still clutched in her hand. She walked back to the desk, her eyes scanning the cluttered surface for anything that might give her more information. It wasn't long before she found a stack of old automotive magazines tucked beneath some loose papers. The covers were yellowed with age. But as she flipped through the pages, she began to piece together a story she hadn't known before. There were articles and interviews with Thomas Morgan, his name appearing alongside some of the most prestigious names in the automotive world. Ferrari and Lamborghini. Her grandfather hadn't just worked for them. He had been instrumental in designing engines, creating components that had made both companies world-renowned. The sheer scale of his involvement was more than she could have imagined. Thomas had been a part of history, but his contributions were buried beneath years of secrecy kept in the shadows, while others took credit for his brilliance. Elellanar felt a mix of awe and frustration. She had known Thomas as the quiet, reserved grandfather who would spend hours tinkering in his garage, but she had never known this side of him. The side that had worked with Enzo Ferrari and helped create the engines that powered some of the most famous cars in history. It was as though Thomas had lived two lives, one as a humble mechanic and the other as a visionary whose work had touched the world in ways no one had ever realized. But despite the excitement, a knot tightened in her chest. Why had Thomas kept this from her? Why hadn't he told her about the role he had played in these iconic brands? She sat down at the desk, her fingers tracing the pages of the magazine as she thought about the enormity of what she was uncovering. This was more than just a hidden fortune or secret cars. It was about understanding who Thomas had truly been and why he had kept so much of himself locked away. Elellanar had always felt a connection to him, but now she realized how little she had truly known. Her grandfather had been a man of mystery, and now it was her turn to uncover the secrets he had left behind. As the night drew on, Elellanar continued to read, lost in the history and details of the projects Thomas had been part of. The pieces were falling into place, but with each discovery the questions kept coming. The journey ahead was unclear, and Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that she was only scratching the surface. The garage, the cars, the magazines, they were all leading her to a deeper understanding of her grandfather. But the path wasn't simple. There was still much to learn, much to uncover. And the more she learned, the more complex the story of Thomas Morgan became. As she closed the magazine, her eyes drifted back to the garage, the cars and Max lying quietly at her feet. What was she meant to do with all of this? She knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in this. She had Max, and with him by her side, she felt ready to continue down this uncertain path to uncover the rest of the story that Thomas had kept hidden for so long. The tension had been building ever since the phone call. Robert's insistence on selling everything to settle their grandfather's debts had left Elellanar feeling increasingly isolated in her own family. She knew Robert was focused on practicality, on the financial side of things. But she couldn't shake the sense that he didn't understand the depth of what Thomas had left behind. The legacy was more than just cars and old papers. It was a part of who they were, who she was. She couldn't allow that to be erased. Elellanar had always thought of Robert as the more pragmatic sibling. While she stayed in Milfield taking care of their family, he had moved to New York, building his career and living a life of ambition. To him, the value of everything was measured in cold, hard numbers. But to Elellanar, it was never about the money. It was about the people, the connections, and the love they gave each other. Now, standing in front of the garage, Elellanar felt more determined than ever to protect Thomas's memory. The cars, the letter, the journal, they were pieces of a puzzle that her grandfather had carefully crafted over the years. She wouldn't let them fall into the hands of someone who couldn't see their true value. Robert had his own priorities, but Elellanar knew this was something only she could understand. When the doorbell rang the next morning, Elellanar knew it was Robert. He had come to inspect the garage and the house with a lawyer in tow. She had been expecting this. The words Robert had said on the phone echoed in her mind, but she knew she wasn't ready to let go of Thomas's legacy. Not yet. Elellanar opened the door. Her face calm but firm, ready to face the confrontation she knew was coming. Robert stepped inside, flanked by the lawyer, a tall man in a suit who looked like he had never seen the inside of a garage before. "We need to go through everything," Robert said without preamble, his eyes scanning the room with the same businesslike precision he always carried. "The bank wants their money, and the sooner we get an inventory of everything, the sooner we can sell it and move on." Elellanar felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could already see where this was heading. The look in Robert's eyes, the way he dismissed the room as if it were just a series of objects to be sold. It made her blood run cold. He didn't see the value in any of it. Not the cars, not the garage, not the memories. It was just about getting rid of things as quickly as possible. "We're not selling everything," Elellanar replied, her voice calm but resolute. "We can't just erase what Grandpa built." Robert's expression hardened, and for a moment the room fell silent. The lawyer shuffled through some papers, clearly uncomfortable, but it was Robert's sharp gaze that Elellanar felt most acutely. "Ellie," Robert said, his voice low but firm, "you're letting sentiment get in the way of practicality. We need to face facts. Grandpa didn't have the means to keep this house, these cars, these relics. They're just assets now, and we need to deal with them. It's time to be realistic." Elellanar's frustration bubbled to the surface. She shook her head. "No, Robert, you're missing the point. These aren't just things to be sold. They're Grandpa's story, his life, and I'm not going to let you just throw them away." Her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and she could see the conflict in Robert's eyes. But before either of them could speak again, the silence was broken by a sudden growl. Max, who had been sitting quietly by the door, suddenly stood up, his hackles raised. His deep protective bark echoed through the room. His eyes locked on Robert. Elellanar's heart skipped a beat. "Max, no!" She called, her voice sharp, but the dog was already moving. In a flash, Max lunged forward, his teeth bared in a show of force that stunned them all. Robert stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock as Max, acting on pure instinct, stood between Elellanar and him. The lawyer jumped back in alarm, but Elellanar remained still, her hand reaching for Max's collar to calm him down. "Max, stop!" Elellanar shouted again, her voice trembling now, both from the adrenaline and the emotional toll of the confrontation. She gently pulled him back, and the dog, still growling reluctantly, obeyed. He sat at her feet, watching Robert with unwavering loyalty. Robert, his breath ragged, looked at her, a mixture of confusion and disbelief on his face. "What the hell, Ellie? Why is your dog attacking me?" Elellanar's chest tightened. "Max was just protecting me. He always has. But you need to understand something, Robert. You can't just walk in here and treat everything like it's just a sale. This is about more than money. Max, now calm but still alert, looked up at her with those knowing eyes. It was as if he too was standing guard. Not just over the house or the cars, but over Thomas's memory, over what was worth protecting. Robert stood silently for a moment, his expression a mixture of frustration and dawning realization. He didn't understand, not yet. But Elellanar wasn't about to give up. She couldn't. The air between Elellanar and Robert hung heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Max, now sitting quietly by her side, watched both of them, his presence a silent reminder of the loyalty and protection Thomas had once given. Elellanar could feel the tension in the room, the clash of two different worlds. Her world shaped by love, memory, and legacy, and Robert's world built on practicality and the pursuit of what could be seen and measured. Robert, his breath still shallow from the surprise, was now standing there, his face a mask of frustration. Elellanar's mind raced as she searched for the right words to explain something her brother, it seemed, could never quite understand. Robert. She began, her voice steady, but filled with the emotion that had been building up since their first phone call. You think all of this, she waved her hand toward the cars, the house, the very space around them, is just a way to make money. You see these cars, this house, and you think, we can sell them, pay off the debt, move on. But that's not what this is. You're missing the point entirely. Robert frowned, his gaze narrowing. You think I don't see the point? We're drowning in debt, Ellie. This house is worth more than we could imagine, and these cars, they're worth millions. You're telling me not to sell them, to keep them for sentimental value? No, Elellanar replied, shaking her head. I'm telling you that these cars, this house, are worth more than money. They're a symbol of Grandpa's life, of his work, of his silent sacrifice. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. Thomas wasn't some poor mechanic. He wasn't someone who lived his life just scraping by. What he had, what he built, was something far more valuable than you could ever measure in dollars. Robert crossed his arms, still skeptical. Then why didn't he ever tell me about it? Why didn't he tell anyone? He was too proud, too stubborn to share it with us. Elellanar's chest tightened. She had heard Robert's words before, and they always struck a nerve. The way he dismissed their grandfather's legacy, his pride, his quiet strength, made it seem as though Thomas had been some sort of failure when nothing could be further from the truth. He didn't want to be defined by what he had, she said softly. He didn't care about recognition or fame. Thomas built things that mattered, things that would last. And he did it all quietly, out of love for the craft, for the work, not for glory or money. Her gaze softened as she looked at the cars again, her heart swelling with pride for the man who had shaped her world. The Ferrari, the Lamborghini, they're not just vehicles. They're symbols of his dedication, his contributions to the world of engineering, to the automotive industry. Those cars, those masterpieces, are proof of what he accomplished in ways that no one ever knew. Max's tail gave a small, almost imperceptible wag, as if to emphasize her words. The old German shepherd sat still, but his eyes, those amber eyes that had seen so much, seemed to hold a wisdom that Elellanar knew she would never fully grasp. Thomas had trusted Max just as he had trusted her. And now Elellanar was the one who would protect what her grandfather had left behind. Those cars, Elellanar continued, her voice rising, with a newfound conviction, are a testament to a life well lived. Grandpa didn't live in luxury. He didn't need anything flashy or expensive. But what he did was create something that would outlast him. Something that told the world he had been here, that he had mattered. She stepped closer to Robert, meeting his eyes. You think the value is in the money we could get from selling them. But the real value is in what they represent. The dedication, the hard work, the years he spent perfecting what he loved. That's why they matter. Not because of the price tag, but because of the story behind them. Robert's expression softened for the first time since the conversation had begun. Elellanar could see the wheels turning in his head, the skepticism slowly giving way to understanding. He still wasn't fully there, but Elellanar could see the cracks forming in the armor he had built around himself. Grandpa wasn't just a mechanic, Robert. He was an artist. He was a visionary. Elellanar whispered, her voice barely audible. And these cars, this garage, are a part of that vision. I won't let them be sold off just to pay off debts. They're more than just things to get rid of. They're part of who we are. Robert remained silent for a long time, his eyes moving from the cars to Elellanar and then back again. He seemed to be processing everything she had said, and in the stillness of the garage, the weight of the conversation hung heavy. Elellanar knew that her brother still had his doubts, but for the first time she could see that he was beginning to understand, even if just a little. She had made her point, and she wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. Not when so much of who she was, who they were, was wrapped up in the legacy Thomas had left behind. The silence in the garage seemed to stretch on as Robert finally sat down, his eyes still fixed on the cars, now softened by Elellanar's words. But despite his apparent shift in understanding, Elellanar felt the need to continue uncovering the depths of Thomas's legacy. She had found the cars, but she knew there was more, hidden away in the very tools and documents her grandfather had left behind. Her heart still pounded from the intense conversation, but her resolve was stronger than ever. This wasn't just about keeping the cars or saving the house. It was about revealing who Thomas had truly been and what his life had meant. It was about preserving his quiet genius and about ensuring his story didn't fade into the shadows. Elellanar slowly moved toward a shelf stacked with dusty folders. There were stacks of old papers, bills, receipts, and letters. But there, buried beneath the clutter, was something far more important. A large leather-bound portfolio caught her attention. It was old, the edges worn from years of use, but the title etched into the cover was Clear Engine Design and Innovations. She carefully pulled it from the shelf and placed it on the workbench. The worn leather creaked under her touch as she opened the first page. The contents were unlike anything she had expected. Pages filled with technical diagrams, detailed sketches of engine components, and mechanical blueprints lay before her. The precise, almost obsessive detail of each drawing revealed a mind focused on perfection. One diagram in particular stood out, a schematic for a Ferrari engine that looked remarkably similar to the designs used in the iconic Ferrari 250 GTO. Beside it, another set of designs showed the inner workings of a Lamborghini engine clearly marked with Thomas's name and the year. Elellanar's hands trembled as she took it all in. These weren't just random designs. They were blueprints for some of the most revolutionary automotive engines ever made. It became clear that Thomas hadn't just been a bystander in the creation of these cars. He had been an integral part of their development, a true engineer who had helped shape the heart of Ferrari and Lamborghini's legendary vehicles. Her grandfather's contributions to these iconic brands were significant, and yet no one, not even Robert, had known about it. She flipped through the portfolio each page, revealing more technical marvels. Drawings of piston designs, engine layout specifications, and notes detailing how Thomas had solved critical engineering problems, enabling these supercars to achieve higher performance. Each diagram was accompanied by detailed calculations and specifications, showing the deep knowledge and precision that had gone into every piece he designed. Max padded over to her, his steady presence a comfort in the midst of the overwhelming discovery. As Elellanar stroked his fur, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Thomas had been more than just a skilled mechanic. He had been a visionary shaping the future of automotive technology with his inventions. Elellanar carefully placed the portfolio back on the workbench, her mind still reeling. Her grandfather had worked alongside legends in the automotive world, and yet he had kept this all hidden. The truth was starting to take shape, and with it came a new sense of purpose for Elellanar. She wasn't just holding on to physical objects. She was guarding a legacy that had the power to change everything. The weight of the discovery settled on her shoulders as she looked at Robert, who was still quietly observing the garage. This was the truth. The legacy Thomas had left wasn't just about the cars. It was about the impact he had on an entire industry and how he had done it without ever seeking recognition. Elellanar knew what she had to do next. She had to make Robert understand. The time for silence was over. Thomas's story needed to be told. The garage, once a place of confusion and silence, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Elellanar stood before Robert, her hands still trembling from the revelations she had uncovered. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the turning point. It was time to make him understand. Robert hadn't spoken much since she had started explaining the significance of the cars and her grandfather's hidden role in their creation. He had simply stood there, arms crossed, watching her, his expression unreadable. But now Elellanar could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She could see that her words were starting to reach him. "Robert," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've always seen Grandpa as a simple mechanic. You've always thought he was just some guy fixing cars in the garage, but he was so much more than that. Thomas, he wasn't just keeping these cars for himself. They weren't his to hoard. They were part of something bigger." Robert shifted slightly, his gaze softening. Elellanar took a step closer, not wanting to lose him now. He worked with Ferrari and Lamborghini Robert. He didn't just work on these cars. He helped design the engines. He was a vital part of the team that created the cars you've always dreamed about. These weren't just some flashy luxury items. They were the result of years of hard work, innovation, and genius. Elellanar explained, her voice rising with each word. Grandpa was part of shaping the very cars you admire. His work revolutionized the industry, and no one, not even you, knew about it. Robert looked away, his eyes darting around the garage as if searching for some form of denial, some reason to reject the reality she was laying out for him. But Elellanar pressed on, determined not to let him retreat into the walls of skepticism that had always protected him. "Don't you see, Robert?" she continued, her voice softening. Grandpa didn't hide these cars or these papers because he was ashamed. He hid them because he didn't want to be defined by the things he had. He didn't care about recognition. What mattered to him was the work itself, the love for the craft. The legacy he left wasn't in titles or accolades. It was in the impact he had on the world. It was in the people who will remember him, not for what he had, but for what he gave. There was a long pause, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Robert's jaw clenched, as if he was struggling with everything he had known to be true. Slowly he turned back toward the cars, his eyes lingering on the Ferrari and the Lamborghini, the glossy, untouched masterpieces that had been hidden in plain sight. Elellanar watched him carefully, her heart beating faster, unsure of where this would go. She had to make him understand. But how? Finally Robert spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I always thought Grandpa was just a man who never got his due. I thought he was stuck here, living in the past, unable to get ahead. I didn't know about all this. His work, his legacy." Elellanar nodded, her chest tight. "He didn't need recognition, Robert. He never did. But he did need someone to see him, to understand what he was capable of, to appreciate what he had built. That's what I want to do now. For him. For us. Robert's face softened as the realization seemed to wash over him. He blinked a few times, almost as if the world had shifted in his eyes. I didn't know, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know any of this. I thought he was just a quiet old man who kept to himself. Elellanar reached out, placing a hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity. I know you didn't, but now you do. And it's not too late, Robert. We can still honor his legacy. We can still protect it. It's not about selling everything to pay off debt. It's about understanding what he left us, what he worked for. Robert nodded slowly, his face conflicted, but Elellanar could see the shift in him. He wasn't there yet, but he was starting to get it. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about wealth or possessions. It was about legacy, respect, and the quiet contributions that had shaped the world. The garage, once filled with the dust of forgotten years, now seemed to pulse with life. Thomas's life. And slowly, Elellanar felt like Robert was starting to see it too. Robert stood still, his gaze fixed on the cars, the quiet hum of realization settling around him like a heavy fog. Elellanar could see the shift in him. The walls he had so carefully built around his emotions, around his family, slowly crumbling. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. But there was something in the way he was looking at the Ferrari and Lamborghini now, as if he was beginning to understand their significance, not just as assets, but as a testament to a life well lived. I was wrong, Ellie. Robert said, his voice rough, as though he had to clear years of accumulated misconceptions. I thought Grandpa was just holding on to things, living in the past. But now I see he wasn't just holding on. He was building something. He was creating something that had meaning beyond money. I didn't get that. Elellanar felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so long trying to make Robert see the value of what Thomas had left behind. But hearing him admit it, hearing him finally get it, was almost too much. She gave his arm a reassuring squeeze, but inside a storm of emotions swirled. She had always known that Robert was capable of seeing the bigger picture, but it had taken so much for him to let go of the narrow view he had held for so long. I never saw it that way. Robert continued, his voice quieter now. I just thought Grandpa was stuck, that he was too proud or too stubborn to accept help. I thought he was too proud to share any of this with us. I didn't know what he had done, what he had given up, what he had created. He turned to face Elellanar, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to make sense of all the new information flooding in. I didn't know what it meant. The sacrifices he made. The things he gave up. He could have had so much more, but he didn't care about that. He cared about the work itself. And I couldn't see that. Elellanar stepped closer, her heart aching for the brother she had once known. She had always believed in their grandfather's quiet greatness, but now Robert was seeing it too. He was starting to realize that Thomas's legacy wasn't just about what was visible on the surface. It was about the silent choices, the quiet sacrifices, and the love of something that transcended fame and fortune. I thought I was doing what was best. Robert went on, his voice tinged with regret. I thought selling the cars, the house, getting rid of everything, was the right thing to do. It felt like the logical thing to do, the practical thing. But I see now. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Elellanar could see the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just apologizing for the actions he had taken. He was acknowledging the loss of something far greater, the relationship. The connection he had never fully understood between their grandfather and the things he had held dear. Robert had spent so many years chasing external success. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to realize that success wasn't about wealth. It was about integrity, about giving without expecting recognition, about building something that lasted long after you were gone. I was so focused on success, Robert said the words almost a confession. I never took the time to see what truly mattered. And now I see it. Grandpa's life was richer than anything I could have ever imagined. And I missed it. Elellanar nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It was a hard realization, but it was a necessary one. Robert wasn't the same person he had been before. She could see the change in his eyes and the way he carried himself now, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, that they could reconcile, that they could honor Thomas in the way he truly deserved. The road to understanding had been long and filled with obstacles, but now it felt like they were finally on the same page. "We can still make things right," Robert Elellanar said softly. "We can protect Grandpa's legacy, his work, and we can do it together." Robert looked at her for a long time, his face softening. Slowly, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're right. We will. I'll help you. Let's keep his memory alive." Elellanar felt a weight lift from her chest, a deep breath she hadn't realized she was holding, finally escaping. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Elellanar truly believed that they were in this together. They would honor Thomas, not just for what he left behind, but for the lessons he had taught them both about what really mattered. The weight of the decision settled heavily on Elellanar's shoulders, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The tension between her and Robert had finally dissolved, and in its place stood a shared resolve to honor Thomas's life, his work, and the legacy he had left behind. Elellanar stood in the garage, her eyes drifting between the two cars, both gleaming in the dim light like precious works of art. They were not just machines, they were symbols of everything Thomas had quietly contributed to the world. Ferrari and Lamborghini, names that would forever be linked to innovation, precision, and brilliance. But Thomas had never sought the recognition or the fame that came with those names. To him, the work had always been enough. But now, it was time to give Thomas the recognition he deserved. After a long moment of quiet reflection, Elellanar turned to Robert, who had been standing silently beside her, watching as she made her final decision. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but there was no doubt in her mind about what she needed to do. "We can't sell them, Robert," she said firmly, her voice steady. "These cars represent something far more than just monetary value. They're part of Grandpa's legacy. They need to be preserved." Robert nodded slowly, his face reflecting a deep understanding. "I know. I've been thinking about it too. These cars, they're not just assets, they're history." Elellanar took a deep breath, the decision solidifying in her heart. "I want to use them for something meaningful. I want to create a scholarship fund for engineering students, something that will honor Grandpa's passion for innovation and his quiet contributions to the world. The scholarship will support young engineers who want to make a difference, just like he did." She paused, her eyes meeting Robert's. "And I want to preserve one of the cars, the Lamborghini, in a museum. A place where people can see the work Grandpa did, where they can learn about his legacy. The world needs to know that Thomas Morgan wasn't just a mechanic. He was an artist, an engineer, and a visionary." Robert looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "That sounds like a great idea. Grandpa always wanted to teach. He wanted to inspire people with his work. I can see that now." Elellanar smiled softly, the weight in her chest lightening. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be paperwork meetings and possibly even resistance from others who didn't understand the true value of what they were preserving. But she felt confident in her choice. This was the right thing to do. Thomas had worked so hard to create something that would stand the test of time, and now it was up to Elellanar and Robert to make sure his legacy lived on. The scholarship fund would not only honor Thomas's memory, but also ensure that his passion for engineering and innovation continued to inspire future generations. "Let's make this happen," Elellanar said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll honor his memory the way he would have wanted us to. We'll make sure the world knows who he really was." Robert's eyes softened as he nodded in agreement. "We will." The two of them stood there in the garage for a moment, the weight of their decisions settling in. But with it came a sense of peace. They had chosen the path that would allow Thomas's legacy to endure, not just as a man who had worked with some of the world's greatest automotive brands, but as a man whose work had changed the course of engineering history. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would honor Thomas. And in doing so, they would honor the love, sacrifice, and dedication that had shaped their family and the world in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. The decision to honor Thomas's legacy was just the beginning. The reality of managing the estate, of dealing with the logistics of what they had uncovered, was a daunting task, but Elellanar and Robert knew they had to see it through. The next steps were critical. They had agreed on one thing: they would preserve the Ferrari, the crown jewel of Thomas's collection. But the Lamborghini would have to be sold to settle the debts and ensure that the family could move forward without financial burden. The thought of selling the Lamborghini, a car so intricately tied to Thomas's legacy, didn't sit well with Elellanar, but she knew it was the right decision. The car would fetch enough to cover the debts and give them the breathing room they needed to honor Thomas's memory the way he would have wanted. The money from the sale would also help fund the scholarship they had discussed, ensuring that the next generation of engineers could carry on Thomas's work and passion for innovation. "We need to make sure that this isn't just a transaction," Elellanar said one evening as they sat in the living room going over the details. The soft glow of the table lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and for the first time in a while, she felt a sense of calm. "We need to set aside some of the funds from the Lamborghini sale to create a trust for the scholarship. It has to be sustainable. I don't want this to just be a one-time thing. I want Grandpa's name to mean something every year." Robert nodded, his face thoughtful. "I agree. We've got to do it the right way. We'll set up a proper foundation, something that will carry on his work long after we're gone. And we'll make sure it's not just about the money. It's about the impact." Elellanar smiled, relieved to see that Robert was fully on board. She had always known that he cared about the family, but the path to understanding what truly mattered in life hadn't always been clear for him. Now they were working together, really working together, for something bigger than either of them. The task of selling the Lamborghini wouldn't be easy. Elellanar knew the car would attract buyers from all over the world, but she wanted to make sure it went to someone who would appreciate its historical significance. She could already imagine the car's future as a prized exhibit in a museum, or as the centerpiece of a collector's garage, preserved not just as a luxury item, but as a part of Thomas's story. Robert, always the practical one, took the reins when it came to handling the sale. He began reaching out to high-end collectors and car dealers, ensuring that the Lamborghini would be sold at its highest value. Elellanar, on the other hand, began working on the details of the scholarship fund. She contacted universities and engineering programs, gathering information on how best to set up the fund and what kind of criteria they wanted to set for the recipients. They agreed to divide the proceeds from the sale between two goals: paying off the debts and securing the Ferrari for the future. The Ferrari would be preserved as part of the family's history, a lasting symbol of Thomas's contribution to the automotive world. The trust would ensure that it stayed within the family, carefully protected and shared with future generations. The remainder of the proceeds would go into the scholarship fund, giving young engineers the opportunity to pursue their dreams without the financial burden that had weighed so heavily on Thomas in his later years. The weight of their decisions didn't feel as heavy anymore. Elellanar knew they were on the right path, and the clarity of their vision for the future made it all seem possible. Together, they were not just managing Thomas's estate. They were creating something that would outlast them both. Something that would continue to inspire long after their time. The grand opening of the Thomas Morgan Museum was set, and the anticipation in the air was palpable. It felt like everything that had been slowly unfolding over the past few months was finally coming together. The Ferrari 250 GTO, once hidden in a dusty garage, now sat in the center of the newly renovated museum, its sleek curves and vibrant red paint gleaming under the spotlight. This was no longer just a car. It had become a living testament to a man who had quietly changed the course of automotive history. The museum, housed in the old family home, had been transformed into a space where Thomas's legacy could be celebrated and shared with the world. The walls, once filled with faded photographs and outdated knickknacks, were now lined with carefully curated exhibits, technical drawings, old tools, and photos from Thomas's time with Ferrari and Lamborghini. The centerpiece was, of course, the Ferrari 250 GTO, displayed on a raised platform with museum-quality lighting that made it seem almost alive. Visitors couldn't help but marvel at the car's timeless beauty, its rarity, and its connection to a history few knew about. As Elellanar stood at the entrance watching the first group of visitors file in, she couldn't help but feel a wave of pride wash over her. People from all walks of life, car enthusiasts, engineers, history buffs, were coming to see what had been kept hidden for so long. They were finally starting to understand who Thomas Morgan had been and the contributions he had made to the world. It wasn't just about the cars. It was about the legacy he had quietly built, and now the world was beginning to recognize it. Elellanar's thoughts were interrupted by Robert, who approached her with a smile on his face. "I never thought I'd see the day when a car like this would be in a museum," he said, his voice filled with awe. "It feels surreal." She smiled back, her heart swelling with emotion. "I didn't think I'd see it either. But this is what Grandpa wanted. He didn't need fame or fortune. He just wanted to build something that would last. And now, it will." The opening ceremony had been a success, drawing crowds from far and wide, but Elellanar knew this was only the beginning. The museum was more than just a place to showcase the car. It was a space for education and inspiration. They had set up workshops and interactive displays allowing visitors to learn about Thomas's work, the engineering principles he had mastered, and the impact he had on the automotive industry. It was a place where young engineers could come and be inspired, just as Thomas had been inspired when he first started his journey. As the evening wore on, Elellanar watched as more people gathered around the Ferrari 250 GTO, admiring its elegance and discussing its design. There was a sense of reverence in the air, and Elellanar felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what her grandfather had worked for. This was his legacy. Quiet, humble, but profound. The museum had become a place where Thomas Morgan's life was finally being acknowledged. His contributions to the world of engineering, the countless hours he had spent perfecting his craft, and the sacrifices he had made to stay true to his work were no longer invisible. People were beginning to understand that true greatness wasn't always celebrated in the headlines. Sometimes it was quietly lived in the workshops and garages where things were built with passion, care, and dedication. As Elellanar stood there taking it all in, she felt a sense of peace. The road had been long filled with hard decisions and difficult conversations. But standing here in the midst of everything Thomas had left behind, she knew it had been worth it. The museum was only the beginning. The museum had opened its doors to the world. But Elellanar knew that the true measure of Thomas's legacy would extend far beyond the walls of the building. It was in the hands of future generations, engineers, innovators, and dreamers who would carry on the work he had started, the work he had done in silence for so many years. As the months passed, the Thomas Morgan Scholarship Fund began to take shape. It wasn't just about the money, though, that was certainly important. It was about creating a foundation that would honor Thomas's memory by investing in the minds of young engineers who shared his passion for innovation. Elellanar worked tirelessly to ensure that the fund would provide opportunities to students who might otherwise never have the chance to pursue their dreams. With Robert's help, they were able to organize fundraisers and establish connections with universities and institutions that had always admired Thomas's work. They reached out to schools encouraging students to apply for the scholarship, and in return, they received letters from all corners of the country. From young men and women who were eager to follow in Thomas's footsteps to create the next generation of engineering breakthroughs. The first group of scholarship recipients arrived at the museum in the spring, eager to meet the family behind the fund that was now helping them achieve their dreams. Elellanar stood in front of them, the weight of responsibility still on her shoulders, but with a sense of pride that filled her heart. These young minds, eager and bright, were the living embodiment of Thomas's legacy. They would go on to create, innovate, and lead, just as he had done in his own quiet way. One by one, the students introduced themselves, each with a unique story, but all with a shared passion for the world of engineering. They spoke of how they had been inspired by Thomas's work, how the designs he had created had sparked their own imaginations. To them, Thomas wasn't just a figure from the past. He was a role model, a guiding light showing them the way forward. As Elellanar listened to their stories, she realized just how much Thomas had influenced the world, even in ways he hadn't known. His humble approach to engineering had been the spark that had ignited a fire in these young individuals, and now they would carry that fire forward into their own careers. They would build on what Thomas had done, creating new designs and solutions, always keeping his legacy alive. Over time, the scholarship fund continued to grow, reaching more students each year. Elellanar was humbled by the impact it was having, by the stories of students who had gone on to work for major companies, who had developed new technologies, and who had made breakthroughs that honored the principles Thomas had believed in: hard work, dedication, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. The museum, too, continued to thrive. Visitors from all over the world came to see the Ferrari 250 GTO and learn about the contributions of Thomas Morgan to the automotive industry. The recognition that had once been denied him was now being showered upon him from all corners of the globe. The museum wasn't just a tribute to a man who had worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. It had become a place of inspiration, a beacon for anyone who had ever believed in the power of quiet dedication. And as Elellanar stood in the museum watching the students interact with the exhibits, she realized something profound. Thomas's legacy wasn't just in the cars, or in the scholarship, or in the museum. It was in every life that had been touched by his work, every person who had been inspired by his vision. His legacy was living on in a way that she had never imagined. It was continuing to grow, expanding in ways that would transcend even her understanding of it. Her grandfather had always believed in the power of quiet work, in creating something of value not for fame, but for the love of the craft. And now, Elellanar could see it. Thomas's life, his work, his passion was continuing to grow, to inspire, to lead. His legacy had been preserved not just in his cars or his inventions, but in the lives of those who would continue the journey he had started. The sun was setting as Elellanar and Robert stood side by side in the small, quiet cemetery at the edge of Milfield. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of fresh flowers and the faint sound of birdsong. It had been a long journey, a journey that had taken them through moments of confusion, conflict, and deep reflection. And now here they were, together standing at Thomas's grave, ready to honor the man who had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Elellanar held the bouquet of white lilies in her hands, the same flowers Thomas had always loved. She bent down, gently placing them at the base of the stone. Robert stood beside her, his face calm, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The distance between them, once so vast, now seemed to shrink with every passing moment. They were no longer just siblings who had been caught in the pull of their differences. They were two people who had come to understand the depth of what their grandfather had left behind and what he had taught them. Together they stood in silence for a while, the weight of their thoughts unspoken but understood. The museum, the scholarship, the cars, all of it had led them to this moment. But it wasn't just about the material things, the tangible legacy. It was about something much deeper. It was about the quiet contributions Thomas had made throughout his life, the love and dedication he had poured into his work, and the lessons he had left for them. Grandpa would have hated all this attention, Robert said softly, his voice almost a whisper. He looked at Elellanar, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But I think he would have liked knowing that people are finally seeing the value in what he did. Elellanar nodded, her eyes misting over as she looked at the headstone. It bore Thomas's name and the simple words engineer, innovator, creator of legacy. She could almost hear his voice in her head, that calm, steady voice that had taught her to value hard work and integrity, not for recognition, but for the satisfaction of doing something well. Yeah, Elellanar said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. He never wanted the spotlight. He just wanted to create. And he did it in the quietest way possible. Robert was silent for a moment, deep in thought. Then he spoke again, his tone quieter, more reflective. I've spent so much of my life chasing success, Ellie. Always measuring it by what I could buy or achieve, what the world could see. But Grandpa, he showed us that real success isn't about what you have. It's about what you give. It's about leaving something that lasts, something that touches lives. I think I've finally gotten that. Elellanar felt a lump rise in her throat. Robert's words were the ones she had always hoped to hear, but hearing him say them now, with the weight of understanding behind them, made her heart swell. She had always known the true value of their grandfather's life, but hearing Robert finally grasp it was like watching a door open to a new world. Sometimes the most valuable things in life, Elellanar said, looking down at the gravestone, are the ones no one else recognizes. They're not always the things you can touch or see. They're the quiet actions, the love, the passion for what you do. That's what Grandpa taught us. Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the stone. He didn't speak for a few moments, but Elellanar could see the change in him. The realization that what they had been searching for all this time wasn't in the wealth, the cars, or the material possessions. It was in the life they had built, the quiet dedication to something greater than themselves. Together they stood there for a while longer, just soaking in the peace of the moment. They had come to terms with the past, with the way things had been, and with what they needed to do moving forward. The path ahead was clearer now. They would continue to honor Thomas's legacy, not just with the cars or the museum, but with the lives they led, the work they did, and the values they carried with them. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Elellanar turned to Robert. Grandpa's legacy will live on, not just in the museum or the scholarship. It'll live on in us, in everything we do. Robert smiled, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. I think he'd be proud of that. Elellanar smiled back, feeling the weight of the years lift off her shoulders. They had honored Thomas, not just in the things he left behind, but in the way they had come to understand what truly mattered. His legacy would continue not just through the cars or the museum, but in the lives of those he had touched. A legacy built on love, sacrifice, and quiet greatness. As Elellanar and Robert stood side by side, watching the legacy of their grandfather unfold before them, one thing became abundantly clear. True greatness lies not in wealth, but in the quiet acts of dedication, love, and loyalty. Thomas Morgan's life had been a testament to this. He had worked tirelessly not for recognition or financial gain, but for the love of his craft and the passion to make a difference, however small it might seem. And in that same spirit, Max the German Shepherd had stood by Thomas's side through it all. His loyalty, unwavering and silent, mirrored the very essence of what it meant to protect, to give, and to be there without expectation. Just like Thomas, Max had worked not for accolades, but for the bond they shared. A bond built on mutual respect, trust, and love. The quiet heroism of animals like Max is a reminder of the profound impact animals have on our lives. They are not just companions. They are our protectors, our confidants, and our teachers. In their silence, they teach us the true value of loyalty and unconditional love. Thomas's legacy, captured in the Ferrari, the Lamborghini, and the scholarship that would continue to inspire generations, was not just about the material world. It was about the heart, the sacrifice, and the quiet, powerful acts of service that changed the world in ways words never can. It was about creating something that would live on long after they were gone. Just like Max, Thomas's love for his work, his family, and his quiet contributions will continue to resonate, teaching us all that greatness doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It can live in the quiet moments, in the relationships we build, and in the loyalty we give to the people and the world around us.